Dr. Sarah Chen stared at her computer screen, her hands shaking as she read the decoded alien message for the fifth time. After 3 years of working on breaking the Galactic Council's encryption, she had finally succeeded. But now she almost wished she hadn't. This can't be right, she whispered to herself in the dim light of her underground lab. The truth was far worse than anyone had imagined. The Global Defense Initiative's basement facility hummed quietly around her as other scientists worked on their regular tasks, unaware that their colleague had just discovered humanity's greatest betrayal. Sarah took a deep breath and began reading the translated message again. Experiment Log 7249. Human subjects continue to show remarkable adaptation to Series K pathogens. Recommend continued testing with enhanced strains. Current quarantine story remains effective for containment. She felt sick. The quarantine that had kept Earth isolated from the rest of the galactic community for the past 2 centuries wasn't protection. It was a cage. And all those diseases that had killed millions. They weren't natural. They were weapons, carefully engineered and released by the very aliens who claimed to be protecting Earth from outside threats. Sarah's hands moved quickly across her keyboard as she dug deeper into the decoded files. Each new document revealed more horrifying details. The Council had been using Earth as their personal testing facility, studying how human immune systems adapted to their engineered diseases. They had watched, documented, and analyzed while people died. The sound of footsteps made her quickly minimize the windows. Dr. James Walker, her supervisor, appeared at her desk with his usual friendly smile. "Still here, Sarah. It's past midnight," he said, holding his coffee mug. Sarah looked up at him, trying to keep her voice steady. "James, I need to show you something, but not here." 20 minutes later, they sat in James's secure office, the door locked and security systems activated. As Sarah showed him the decoded messages, his coffee grew cold, forgotten on his desk. "My God," he whispered, his face pale in the blue light of the monitor. "How many people died while they watched? How long have they been doing this to us?" "At least 200 years, Sarah replied, pulling up another file. "Look at this. They chose Earth because our immune systems are unique. We adapt faster than any other known species. They've been using us as lab rats to develop their biological weapons." James stood up suddenly, his chair rolling back. "We need to tell the Council of Nations immediately." "Wait," Sarah grabbed his arm. "If we go public with this, the Council might panic and release something worse to silence us. We need to be smart about this." James slowly sat back down, his expression changing from shock to something harder. "You're right. We need a plan." They spent the next hour laying out a strategy. First, they would quietly inform key scientists and military leaders. Then, they would begin gathering all the evidence while keeping up appearances with the Galactic Council. As dawn broke over the facility, Sarah and James had set in motion what would become humanity's greatest act of revenge. But unlike their alien oppressors, they wouldn't rely on brute force or simple violence. They would be smarter. They would be patient. "They think we're just test subjects," Sarah said as she gathered her things to leave. "But they're about to learn that humans are the most dangerous when they're cornered." James nodded, his face grim. "They've spent centuries studying how we survive their weapons. Now they'll learn how we fight back." Neither of them knew it yet, but this morning would later be marked in history as the day humanity began its most ambitious plan, one that would shake the Galactic Council to its core. 5 years had passed since Dr. Sarah Chen's discovery. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, in a facility unknown to the Galactic Council, humanity's greatest minds worked in silence. Dr. Chen walked through the underground lab, her footsteps echoing off the steel walls. Around her, hundreds of scientists from every nation worked together, united by a single purpose: revenge. But not the simple, violent revenge the aliens might expect. This was something far more elegant. "Dr. Chen," called out Dr. Rodriguez, waving from his workstation. "The latest test results are in. You need to see this." Sarah hurried over, her heart racing. On the screen, microscopic organisms danced in a petri dish, changing color from blue to green. These weren't ordinary bacteria. They were humanity's secret weapons, engineered using the very knowledge they'd gained from studying the Council's attacks. "They're perfect," she whispered, watching the organisms multiply. "How long until they reach full maturity?" 48 hours, Rodriguez replied with a grin. "And the best part? They're completely harmless to humans. We've finally done it." In another section of the facility, Dr. James Walker stood before a group of military leaders from different countries. A large screen behind him showed pictures of various alien species from the Council. "Our agents have successfully infiltrated 23 Council worlds," he explained, pointing to the maps. "They think we're just eager immigrants, looking for work in their grand civilization. They have no idea each person carries a small piece of our plan." General Zhang from China raised her hand. "And the Council suspects nothing." James smiled. "They're too arrogant. They see us as primitive beings who got lucky with space travel. Our people report that the aliens laugh at how excited humans seem about simple jobs like cleaning their ships or maintaining their air systems." "Perfect," the general replied. "Let them laugh." In her private office, Sarah reviewed the latest reports. The plan was working better than they'd hoped. Humans were now present on every major council world, working in positions that seemed low and unimportant. But each position had been carefully chosen. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Walker entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Remember when we first started this?" he asked, handing her a cup. "Everyone thought we were crazy." Sarah took a sip and nodded. "They said we should just attack with weapons, show our strength the old-fashioned way. Instead, we showed patience," James said proudly. 5 years of careful planning, while they think we're just happy to be allowed into their society." A red light began flashing on Sarah's computer. An incoming message from one of their agents on the Council's capital world. She opened it quickly, reading aloud. "Primary air filtration systems accessed. Awaiting final authorization." Sarah and James looked at each other. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. Their agents had gained access to every major environmental system in the Council's worlds. The aliens had never considered that the humans doing basic maintenance would be scientists and engineers in disguise. "Should we begin?" James asked quietly. Sarah thought about all the millions who had died from the Council's experiments, about how they had treated Earth like a laboratory and humans like test animals. Her finger hovered over the keyboard. "Not yet," she said finally. "Let's wait for the Council's grand celebration next week, when they're all gathered to celebrate their generous acceptance of humanity into their society." James finished her sentence. "That's when we'll show them what humanity has learned from their lessons." In labs across the facility, the engineered organisms continued to multiply, waiting to be released. Soon, the Council would learn that their greatest mistake wasn't experimenting on humans. It was teaching humans how to experiment back. The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council sparkled with lights and decorations. Aliens of all species gathered for what they called the Integration Celebration, the formal acceptance of humanity into their society. High above, crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across the marble-like floors. Sarah Chen stood among the human delegation, wearing her best diplomatic smile. She watched as council members walked past, their expressions showing everything from curiosity to barely hidden contempt. None of them suspected that every human in the room was a carefully chosen scientist or agent. Dr. Chen, a tall, blue-skinned alien, approached her. "I am High Counselor Zix. We are most pleased with how cooperative humans have become." Sarah bowed slightly, suppressing her anger at his condescending tone. "We're grateful for the opportunity to join Galactic Society, High Counselor. Humans have so much to learn from the Council's wisdom." Across the room, Dr. James Walker was speaking with a group of alien scientists, playing the role of an eager student. "Your bioengineering achievements are amazing," he said, his voice filled with carefully practiced awe. "We hope to learn your techniques." The alien scientists laughed among themselves. One of them, a creature with 4 eyes, spoke kindly as if to a child. Perhaps in a few centuries, your species will understand the basics. James nodded humbly while sending a subtle hand signal to Sarah. Everything was in place. In the service areas below the Grand Hall, human workers moved quietly through the air handling systems. They were supposedly doing routine maintenance, a job considered too lowly for most alien species. No one paid attention as they placed small containers at crucial points. Sarah checked her hidden communicator. Messages from across council space flashed silently. Capital World Systems ready. Colony Sector 3 in position. Military bases secured. She took a deep breath and approached the main podium where the council leaders had gathered. As the newest species to be accepted, she was expected to give a speech. Honored members of the council, she began, her voice carrying across the hall. Humanity stands before you, humbled by your acceptance. The council members nodded approvingly, not noticing the slight tremor in her hands, not from fear, but anticipation. For centuries, we developed in isolation, suffering through diseases and hardships. She continued, watching several council members shift uncomfortably at the mention of diseases. But those challenges made us stronger. They taught us adaptation. She pressed a hidden button on her bracelet. Throughout the building, the small containers began releasing their contents into the air systems. In fact, Sarah's voice grew stronger. We've learned so much about adaptation, about how to survive, about how to evolve. The first council member sneezed, then another. Around the room, aliens began to feel strange sensations. Nothing painful, but something was changing. What we want to share with you today, Sarah's diplomatic smile transformed into something harder, is exactly what we've learned from all those lessons you gave us. Panic began to spread as council members realized something was wrong. Security forces moved toward the human delegation, but stopped when their own leaders raised their hands. What? What is this? High Counselor Zix demanded, his blue skin taking on a slightly different shade. Consider it a gift, Sarah replied calmly, just like all the gifts you gave Earth over the centuries. But don't worry, we're not as cruel as you were. This won't kill anyone. It will just make you feel. Around her, the carefully laid plan of 5 years began to unfold. Humanity's revenge wasn't just about punishment, it was about justice. And justice, they had decided, would begin with truth. High Counselor Zix sat alone in his private chamber on Nexus Prime, staring at his reflection in the polished metal wall. His normally blue skin had taken on a purple tinge, the first visible sign of the human-engineered organisms at work. But the physical changes were nothing compared to what was happening inside his mind. For the first time in his 300-year life, he felt something new, guilt. Memories that had once filled him with pride now made him sick. He remembered signing orders for new disease releases on Earth, watching through surveillance as humans struggled and died. At the time, it had seemed so clinical, so necessary for scientific progress. Now, each death felt personal, heavy, crushing. High Counselor, his assistant called through the door. The emergency session is starting. In the council's emergency chamber, chaos reigned. Representatives from every major species argued and shouted. Some were crying, an action many of their species had never physically done before. Dr. Sarah Chen stood calmly at the center of the storm. Dr. James Walker stood beside her, both watching as their plan unfolded. "What have you done to us?" demanded Counselor Vryn, her crystalline form vibrating with distress. These feelings. We've given you something you should have had all along," Sarah replied. "Empathy. Real, human-level empathy. Now you can feel the weight of every death you caused, every family you destroyed." A younger council member rushed at them, but stopped suddenly, dropping to his knees. "The children," he whispered. "I can feel what their parents felt when they died. Make it stop. Please make it stop." James stepped forward, You had no problem watching human children suffer. Why should we stop your suffering now? On the massive screens around the chamber, reports flooded in from across council space. The engineered organisms had spread through every major world's air systems. Carried by the very maintenance networks humans had been allowed to work in. High Counselor Zix entered the chamber, his steps unsteady. The room fell silent. "I have seen our truth," he said, his voice shaking. "We are monsters. We killed millions of humans, experimented on them, watched them suffer, all while telling ourselves it was for scientific progress." Sarah walked up to him, her voice firm, but not cruel. "Yes, you did. And now you understand exactly what that means. Every single council member who approved those experiments, who watched and did nothing. You'll all feel the full emotional impact of your choices." "How long?" another council member asked. "How long will this last?" "That depends on you," James answered. "We have a cure, but it comes with conditions." The room erupted again, but Zix raised his hand for silence. The weight of centuries of guilt pressed down on him, making his shoulders sag. "Name your conditions." Sarah pulled out a data tablet. "First, a complete dismantling of the current council power structure. Second, full reparations to Earth for all the damage you've caused. Third, a new governing body will be formed, with humanity holding a permanent seat. And if we refuse," someone shouted from the back. "Then you keep your new emotions," Sarah said simply. "Forever. You live with the guilt, the shame, the horror of what you've done, just like the survivors of your experiments had to live with their losses." Zix looked around the room at his fellow council members. Some were weeping, others looked shell-shocked. All were changed. In just 24 hours, humanity had accomplished what centuries of warfare could not. They had broken the council's arrogance not through force, but through truth. "We accept," he said quietly, and for the first time, he truly understood what humans meant when they spoke of justice. The galactic media couldn't broadcast the footage fast enough. Across thousands of worlds, aliens watched in shock as their most powerful leaders broke down one after another. It had been 3 days since humanity's engineered organisms had spread through the council worlds, and their effect was devastating. In the main broadcasting chamber of Nexus Prime, Dr. Sarah Chen watched as another council member faced the cameras. This time, it was Supreme Judge Krell, known for his ruthless decisions against other species. "I sentenced millions to death," Krell sobbed, his scaled face wet with tears his species had never shed before. "I approved experiments, horrible experiments, not just on humans, but on other races too. We told ourselves it was for the greater good." Behind the cameras, Dr. James Walker monitored the biological readings. The engineered organisms were working perfectly, spreading from person to person through the standard air filtration systems every council building used. "Look at these readings," he whispered to Sarah. "The emotional centers of their brains are finally working like ours. They're experiencing real empathy, maybe for the first time in their species' history." On another screen, reports showed council members on different worlds having similar breakdowns. Some confessed to crimes nobody had known about. Others simply sat in corners, overwhelmed by their new emotions. "Breaking news," the alien announcer's voice trembled. "High Council member Vex has stepped down after admitting to authorizing illegal genetic experiments on 15 different species. This marks the 20th Council resignation today." Sarah walked through the broadcasting station, passing aliens from various species. Some looked at her with fear, others with a new kind of respect. A few even bowed their heads in shame as she passed. "Dr. Chen," called out a young alien reporter, "is it true that humans could have made these organisms deadly? That you chose to make us feel instead of killing us?" Sarah stopped and faced the cameras. "We learned from your mistakes. The Council spent centuries proving that killing doesn't solve problems. It only creates more victims. We chose a different path." In the station's main control room, James received an urgent message. He quickly called Sarah over. "The military bases," he said, showing her the screen. Their commanders are standing down. All of them. They say they can't bear the thought of causing more pain. Sarah nodded. This was exactly what they had planned for. The Council's mighty military, built on emotional detachment and cold logic, was crumbling under the weight of real human feelings. "Get me a direct line to all networks," she commanded. The station staff rushed to comply. Moments later, Sarah stood before the cameras, her image broadcasting to every council world. "To all watching," she began, "you're experiencing something humans have lived with since our beginning. The full spectrum of emotion, including guilt and empathy. We understand it's overwhelming. We understand it hurts." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But this is the gift of humanity. The ability to feel deeply, to understand the pain of others, to know when we've done wrong. Your leaders used to joke that humans were too emotional, too weak. Now you understand that feeling emotions, processing them, learning from them, that's real strength." Around her, alien staff members wiped away tears they'd never cried before. In the background, another council member began their confession on a different channel. "The cure exists," Sarah continued. "But first, justice must be served. Real justice, not revenge. The kind of justice that comes from understanding the pain you've caused." As she finished speaking, James showed her the latest reports. The organism had reached even the furthest council colonies. There was no stopping it now. The age of emotional suppression and cold calculation was over. The galaxy would never be the same. 1 week had passed since humanity's engineered organisms had changed the galaxy. In the Great Assembly Hall of Nexus Prime, representatives from every affected world gathered for what would become known as the Terminal Council. Dr. Sarah Chen stood at the podium, holding a small silver container. Inside was humanity's promised cure, the key to ending the emotional turmoil that had brought the mighty Galactic Council to its knees. Dr. James Walker sat in the front row, watching the desperate faces of the alien leaders. "Before we discuss the cure," Sarah began, her voice echoing through the hall, "let's review what humanity demands." The room fell silent. Even the soft whirring of environmental systems seemed loud in the quiet. First, she held up one finger, the complete dissolution of the current Galactic Council. All power structures, all military commands, all research facilities. Everything ends today. High Counselor Zix, his blue skin now a permanent shade of purple, nodded slowly. "Agreed. We are not fit to lead." Second, Sarah continued, "Earth will receive full reparations. Every credit spent on experiments, every resource used against us, it all comes back to Earth, with interest." A financial minister started to object but stopped when the weight of guilt crashed over him again. The organisms made sure no one could hide from the consequences of their actions. Third, Sarah's voice grew stronger. "A new governing body will be formed. The Galactic Assembly, where every species has equal representation. No more empires, no more experiments, no more treating lesser species like laboratory animals." James stood up and handed Sarah a thick stack of documents. These papers contained the full terms, including the requirement that all biological research must follow strict ethical guidelines written by humans. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The species they had once considered too primitive to join their society would now write their rules. "And the cure?" Someone called out desperately. "When do we get the cure?" Sarah held up the silver container. "The cure is simple. A single dose will return your emotional responses to their natural state. But understand this, you'll remember everything. Every feeling, every realization, every moment of guilt. The cure stops the enhanced emotions, but it doesn't erase what you've learned." She walked down from the podium, moving through the crowd. Aliens who had once looked down on humans now shrank back as she passed. More importantly, she stopped in the center of the room. "The cure is coded to human DNA. Only humans can administer it. If you ever think about taking revenge, about hurting Earth again." She let the threat hang in the air. The message was clear. Humanity would hold this power over them forever. James joined her, carrying a datapad. The first doses will be administered after every representative signs the new charter. And remember, we're monitoring everything. Any sign of retaliation, any hint of returning to your old ways, we'll release a new version of the organisms, Sarah finished, one that makes these emotions feel mild in comparison. The signing began immediately. One by one, representatives from every council world put their marks on the new charter. Each signature marked the end of the old order and the beginning of something new. As the last name was recorded, Sarah opened the silver container. "Line up," she commanded. "It's time to begin the new age, an age where every species understands the weight of their actions, an age where humanity's greatest weakness, our emotions, has become our greatest strength." The cure would work, but the galaxy would never forget the week when humanity taught them the true meaning of justice. 5 years after the event that became known as the Great Awakening, the galaxy had changed beyond recognition. In the newly built Galactic Assembly headquarters on Earth, Dr. Sarah Chen looked out over the Singapore skyline, where human and alien ships flew peacefully together. "Madam President," her assistant called softly, "the first graduating class is ready." Sarah smiled. Below the building, in a vast auditorium, alien students from across the galaxy waited. They were the first class of the new Galactic Ethics Institute, a mandatory school for anyone wanting to conduct biological research. Dr. James Walker met her at the entrance to the auditorium. His hair had more gray now, but his eyes still showed the same determination from years ago. "Ready to face your students?" he asked, straightening his formal robes. "Our students," Sarah corrected him. "We did this together." They walked onto the stage together, facing hundreds of young aliens who looked at them with respect rather than the contempt their species once showed. In the back row, Sarah noticed several former council members who had chosen to stay on Earth and help teach about their past mistakes. "Welcome, future scientists of the galaxy," Sarah began. "You are the first class to graduate under humanity's ethical guidelines. You have learned not just the how of science, but the why. Not just the could, but the should." James stepped forward. "Each of you has experienced our emotional enhancers in controlled doses during your training. You understand now what your predecessors didn't. That progress without empathy isn't progress at all." In the audience, a young Nexian raised her hand, her skin the same blue shade her species was known for before the Great Awakening. "Dr. Chen, is it true that humans could have used their discovery to rule the galaxy? That you chose teaching over power?" Sarah nodded. "We could have. The original organisms are still in our vaults, along with stronger versions. But Earth remembers what it's like to be under the boot of an oppressor. We chose a different path." From her podium, Sarah could see the city beyond the windows. Humans and aliens walked together on the streets, worked together in labs, learned from each other in universities. The reparation money had transformed Earth, but the knowledge exchange had changed both societies. "Today," she continued, "you graduate not just as scientists, but as guardians of ethics. You carry with you humanity's greatest lesson, that true strength lies not in the power to destroy or dominate, but in the wisdom to feel, to understand, and to show mercy." James activated the main screen, showing images from their shared history. The old council chambers, the first confessions, the signing of the new charter, and finally, the construction of the Galactic Assembly. "Some called our revenge merciless," he said. "But true mercilessness would have been letting the galaxy continue without understanding the impact of its actions. We showed more mercy in our revenge than the Council showed in its rule." As the ceremony concluded, Sarah watched the graduates receive their certificates. Each one had personalized genetic coding that would alert Earth if they ever attempted to create weapons like those used against humanity. Trust, but verify. Another human lesson the galaxy had learned. 5 years, James said quietly beside her. "Did you ever think we'd get here?" Sarah watched as humans and aliens mingled freely, sharing jokes and congratulations. The former council members in the back row were smiling. Real smiles, not diplomatic ones. "We did better than revenge," she replied. "We created understanding." And understanding. She looked out at the transformed galaxy. That's the greatest power of all. The sun set on another day in the new galaxy. A galaxy forever changed by humanity's most powerful weapon, the ability to make others feel.